Welcome to another episode in the podcast series by Helping Crisis 246, where we focus on teaching what you can do in moments of mental or emotional crisis and where you can find help. But the series is not limited to focusing on crisis events. We provide information on coping techniques that anyone can use during some of life's most difficult and stressful moments with the aim of keeping you off the edge. Because remember, mental health is not just about mental illness, but mental health deals with your everyday mental, social, emotional, and psychological well-being, how you make decisions, and how you cope during stress. So we try to share as many tips as we can on the best ways to cope during stress so that you can have healthier mental and emotional well-being. I'm Michelle Russell. I'm an attorney, but more importantly, a mental health advocate. And if you're wondering why I'm so passionate about mental health, you can watch episode 1 where I explain that. And while you're there, feel free to check out any of the other episodes that might speak to you. Now, today, we are going to be focusing on the topic of emotional intelligence. It's a term we hear thrown around a lot, and some of us don't really know what it means. So for that, today I have with me Simone Lewis, who is a counseling psychologist, and she's particularly passionate about the topic of emotional intelligence. If you go on her page, the Phoenix Counseling Services. Yes, I will have it up there at the top. If you go on her page, you'll see she has quite a number of posts on emotional intelligence, and I encourage you to check it out. Simone, thanks for agreeing to do this.
Thanks for having me.
She's much more soft-spoken than me, so I'm going to bring my voice down a little so I can have that soothing therapist. So
I will try for you guys to speak a little louder, but that's a little bit uncomfortable for me.
Oh, that's fine. No problem. We try to make this a safe, comfortable space. Why emotional intelligence? Why are you so passionate about it?
Actually, I recently got into talking about emotional intelligence. It was really finding myself that helped me look into emotional intelligence, because I find that I would personally say emotional intelligence is finding yourself and loving yourself. Because I think a lot of us don't actually love ourselves, and that's why we don't really understand our self-awareness or emotional regulation. Even the emotions that we have, we kind of just take what other people are saying as ourselves instead of finding out for ourselves who we are, and then we kind of just bounce around in life.
So, okay, break down for us. What exactly is emotional intelligence?
Okay, so emotional intelligence is knowing your self-awareness, your self-regulation, which is also emotional regulation, finding empathy for people instead of just sympathy for people. So understanding others' emotions and things that they may be going through, but also understanding yourself. So if one has self intelligence, emotional intelligence, you can know, what am I feeling today? Why am I feeling this way? How am I treating other people? How are my relationships going, that I can adjust to them, learn more about myself, and become more true to myself. So each step of the way is usually broken down. And the parts that I like to focus on are the empathy and self-awareness and emotional regulation. Because I've personally struggled with emotional regulation. As a child, I've always been very emotional. And I put that in quotes because as people in Barbados are, you don't really hear of children being emotional. They're kind of considered to be weak if they show too much emotion, and stuck up if they don't show enough emotion. So I've been on the side of, I cry for everything. If it's one thing I'm gonna do is cry. So I've always been seen as you said, soft spoken and quiet and just more emotional than peers of mine. And I've struggled with finding a way to regulate that. And by that I mean, I struggle with, if I get upset, I don't really know how to bring it back and kind of quiet my mind and say, okay, it's okay to be upset, without it lasting for a long period of time. So I've experienced depression and anxiety. And as you see with those disorders or illnesses, however you would like to put it, You kind of just, you don't know how to combat, especially with anxiety, when the world feels like if it's crashing down on you in a particular moment. It's very hard to say, okay, I'm safe, and I can survive this moment, especially for people who've been through a lot of trauma. I've been through a lot of trauma. So it's just like, it's hard to bring yourself back and say, yeah, I can totally handle this situation.
You said you made a distinction between sympathy
Mm-hmm.
and empathy.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned trauma. So I want us to address
Mm-hmm.
those. What's the difference between sympathy and empathy?
Well, empathy is more understanding somebody's situation, while sympathy will be feeling sorry for that person. So if you're going through a breakup, I may never have gone through a breakup, and I can be like, okay, I'm so sorry to hear that you've gone through a breakup, but I'm not really trying to, and I might not quite understand, and I'm not necessarily trying to figure out what you may be feeling, what you may be going through. So, from the point of view of the person who's going through the breakup, you may be like, okay, I don't want to go and party. And the sympathizer would be like, but you should go and party, get back up. You're single now, let's party and what's not. They're not trying to understand what you really need. And somebody who's more empathetic will try to understand what you're feeling, and then kind of try to help deal with that emotion of what you're feeling. So for me, empathy is more emotion based. Sympathy is kind of like a pat on the back to me.
So sympathy is a mental or intellectual understanding of
Yes.
the situation
Mm-hmm.
without the feelings attached
Yes.
to it.
And
Whereas the empathy is both.
Yes.
Not only do I understand, but I can feel your pain,
Mm-hmm.
even if I've never experienced it
Yeah.
or fully gone through it.
Yes.
Okay, so emotional intelligence allows us to be both
Mm-hmm.
because we develop self-awareness and awareness of others. Help me
Yes.
here.
Yes. Definitely, it helps you to develop both, because as I said in the beginning, it's dealing with other people and their emotions as well as your own. And
so being able to recognize and name your emotions and recognize and name someone else's emotions.
Yes.
Got you.
And understanding that those two emotions might be the same word but look different for other people. That's part of the empathy. So your anger may be fighting people. My anger may be internal and shutting down and not speaking to anybody. So emotional intelligence also helps with that. If you're well versed in it, I should say, it helps you to figure out how other people's emotions may look different from yours.
How they process
Yes.
the same thing.
Mm-hmm. It also takes patience. Let's just say that, a lot of patience. Because even with yourself, you may think that you exhibit certain qualities in a certain way, but in learning yourself a bit more, you can find patterns of why you behave a certain way. You were asking me about trauma.
Yes, so
before.
how do you define trauma? Because it's a word that's thrown around nowadays.
My definition or interpretation of trauma is an event that is very like world changing. So it literally makes you shift a perspective of things, and it's more in a negative light than in a positive one. So I guess like a paradigm shift, where you may encounter individual or a situation that pushed a boundary that you may have had. You may not have even known that you had that boundary. But as we grow up, we develop certain boundaries of limitations of what we want and don't want. And with trauma, for me, it's usually that someone crossed the line, and now you've been kind of triggered into shutting down. Your automatic survival response was to get away, or it has harmed you so much that you don't even know how to handle it. Like some people don't even remember some events that have happened to them.
Disassociation, yes. Right?
So that's how I interpret trauma. So,
which is very similar to how, I don't know if you follow Dr. Gabor Mate.
Yes.
And he mentions that we keep thinking trauma are these major events only, such as war and rape, which are traumatic events. But he says trauma could be something as simple as not being fed,
Yes.
or having your emotional needs neglected. And so I like your definition when you say it's something that happened that caused a paradigm shift and changed your worldview. And I think I like that because it's more encompassing.
Yes.
And I keep saying if more people understood that trauma is not this big one event that happens, they'd be more open to therapy.
They would.
But people keep thinking if I wasn't raped or I didn't go through war and these
Yeah.
things that we label as only trauma, then they never realize, no, there's wounding.
Yes.
And you need to come and find ways to heal that wound.
There's a lot of trauma that happens as we grow with our parental relationships. We don't see or understand that there's a lot of trauma that happens in that relationship. But as we know, your parent was raised by their parent and their parent and so on. And everyone is dealing with what they have.
And doing the best they can with the knowledge they
are.
have, right?
However, that can also be quite traumatizing for your child. Let's say for someone who can't afford certain like groceries or everyday things. No one is bashing the parent and saying, oh, you need to have things that you can't have. Like you're literally, that's all you can provide and you're doing what you can do. However, your child has to interact with people who have more than them and they have to fight within themselves to be like, okay, well, I don't have this. I've had to adjust. And now, let's say corned beef and biscuits is my regular. And I go to my friend's house for a sleepover and they're having waffles and eggs and this and that. And you're seeing how their relationship is with their income, their parents' income and stuff. And that's a small thing. If you think like when you just look at it, you're like, it's breakfast and the child is going to eat whatever a child's going to eat. However, when you look at the dynamics that people have when they're making friends and how they see other people's parents treat them, they're stepping out of what they know, their boundary box, and they're going into somebody else's space. And they're kind of being like, this is not how my life is. And why do I have to go through this? I didn't ask to do this. Especially as a child, you're just like, well, I didn't ask to be brought into this world. And I didn't necessarily ask for my mom to be poor. So why do these people get to have money and we don't get to have money? And you might think, oh, a child's not going to think about it. As you grow up, you think about it more and more.
I grew up without, and I can tell you for a fact, I had that mental struggle.
And that is, it might seem so dramatic to be like, oh, that's trauma. That's just growing up. That's just like, it's small things like that that can be traumatizing for certain people. Some people don't acknowledge it, but there are people who,
because it leaves an imprint, a mental and emotional imprint, and it's more often than not subconscious than anything else, so that you grow up determined to never be poor again. So that you create habits of chasing money or anxiety around money or overspending or keeping up with the Joneses or having a particular image, and you don't realize it's related to how you processed
as a child.
There you go.
And then that affects our romantic relationships and our own relationships with our children. Because now, as many people, I myself fell into that trap of being like, I don't want to be anything like my parent. Whenever I was mad, being like, I would never talk to my child like that, and I would never do this, and I would never do that. And then I don't have any children yet, but I'd be like, I'm gonna do this and this differently. And it's just like a shift in perspective has happened for me as I've grown older and realized it's not that simple. But I said that to say, like, you think that you're gonna change everything, as some people do. They drastically change and they make sure that they're never anything like what their parent was to them. So that's shaping a whole relationship.
A trauma response. You build your whole world around this thing you're afraid of and never want to become, rather than learning to heal and embrace it and say, even if I recognize certain traits of them in myself, I don't have to fully become them, and I can forgive it in myself. Because more often than not, when you see, because I know for me, when I see myself with certain traits, I'm like, oh my God. And I get so upset with myself. And now like my focus is, how do I not do this again? And rather than taking a moment and going inside and saying, why did I react this way? actually bad, or is it just something I hated? And addressing it and healing through it rather than running and running and running from it.
And when we run, we're kind of putting new traumas onto our children because they're not going to understand why. Why can't I go to a grocery store, a specific grocery store? You might be traumatized and be like, I never want my children to have to go to that grocery store. And they're growing up being like, why is this such a big thing? And that's how we don't realize that we're actually traumatized about smaller things, because it's just like we've now put limits and boundaries on our children, and they're fighting back against us how we were fighting back against our parents. And then the cycle just keeps going and going and going. And then in romantic relationships, we tend to put a lot of pressure on our partners to make sure that we don't have this life that we saw happening with our parents. So sometimes we try to go for the opposite partner, or we end up going for a partner that's exactly like one of our parents and repeating a cycle. And as you choose a partner, when the same thing I was just saying about choosing somebody similar or completely opposite, we don't realize how it goes down and how we repeat patterns that we saw before. We think that we're doing like the complete opposite, but sometimes we end up falling into that pattern and treating people how we saw our parents to be treated. And you might go for a partner that doesn't argue, that doesn't emotionally like lash out, and then you turn out to be the one that's emotionally lashing out because you've seen that all your life. That's how you see people in relationships. That's what you saw with your mom and dad. You saw the toxicity. And even though you wanted healthy, even though you were trying to go for healthy, you ended up repeating those patterns.
So how can we stop those patterns?
We usually have to use emotional intelligence to figure out when it's happening. And it's difficult because you first have to learn yourself and to learn the negative traits of yourself. Figure out, as you were saying before, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why did I react this way? So if you're in a relationship right now and you figure that at times y'all are just getting into these arguments and it just keeps escalating the same way, like break it down. You don't have to necessarily go to therapy, but y'all can sit down with each other and break down, and the person can express what they're thinking and why they did something. But it takes both parties in in any relationship to sit down and go through it and to respect the other person's views and their emotions as well. That is very difficult to do. And as a female for myself, it's very difficult to sit down and listen to why a male did a certain thing, because in the back of your head you're just like, you're just being dumb, you're just not thinking, you could just do better. But sometimes females, we can do better too. We could do better as well. So you have to just sit down and listen to them and express yourself. So you have time to talk and let them have time to talk, and really and truly dive deep into the emotions, the reactions, where it may be coming from. So if you are having difficulty with trying to figure out where it's coming from and you both are just hitting ahead, then you might seek someone else to help you do that. But that's not me forcing therapy on anybody. That's just saying, like, you have to empathize with the person and understand that their background is different from yours, and also understand we view ourselves from some people view ourselves from a perspective of, this is my world and everybody else is just in it, and therefore nobody else's emotions necessarily matter as much as mine do. So like, they're side characters and I'm a main character, and I'm upset right now, I'm angry or I'm sad, and they have to listen to me, they have to understand why I'm upset, and they have to fix whatever they did to upset me. And when I've upset them, it's like, oh, sorry. And you don't put as much emphasis as you want others to put into you. I don't necessarily blame people for having that perspective, because it's hard to put yourself in other people's shoes and empathize with them. But you have to notice that you're doing that in order to combat doing that. So you have to stop and say, have I actually taken into account that person's emotions and feelings? Have I listened to why they're doing what they're doing? Do I understand that their mom is not my mom? Their dad is not my dad. They haven't had the experiences that I've had. And it may seem silly to say this out loud, but when you sit down and think about it, it's like the life that I've grown up having is completely different from theirs. Like they literally may have never experienced the cartoons that I've watched, the foods that I've eaten, the people that I've experienced. And because they haven't had that upbringing, they don't know certain nuances, cultural things that they may be stepping on. They don't understand why I'm reacting the way that I'm reacting because they didn't grow up experiencing emotions that way. And when we go into other relationships, romantic relationships, we honestly have to love ourselves enough to break down the negatives in us, the positives in us, and see how can I change this? How can this benefit my relationship? How can I work on this? And how can they work on certain things? How can we facilitate like a growth together, an emotional growth together? Not
I am
just
so grateful. I feel like I'm gonna have to be picking your brain again at some point because you touched on some other things I'd really love to get into, but I do know this interview is long. But thank you for sharing, more importantly, for sharing so openly. So thank you. So remember, if there's anything that stuck out to you, you can pause, rewind, fast forward, or watch again at a later date to remind you. And normally, this is the part where I say that the series is not intended to replace professional advice, but we really do have a professional here, so I don't know that it applies. But if you find that you might be struggling right now, we do encourage you to consider reaching out to any of the hotline numbers to get some support, and we'll be updating the website to include information on local psychologists, therapists, counselors like Simone, so that you can reach out and get help where you need. So thanks again for watching, and remember in the interim to make your mental health a priority. See you next time.